So to kick things off, I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Emily Waffler. I am a consultant at South Pole, and I will be today's moderator for this event. To kick things started, I will turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with David and then working our way down to Reed.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is David Jaber. I'm the founder of Climate Positive Consulting. So we're a firm that's headquartered in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area, and our focus is supporting companies on climate strategy, carbon footprint analytics, and greenhouse gas reduction. I guess I'll hand it over to Anna.
There, my name is Anna Sampson. I'm the director of We Are Neutral, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that has 13 years of experience helping businesses and individuals understand, track, reduce, and offset their comprehensive carbon footprints. We help to identify the key contributors of their carbon footprints, giving them the opportunity to take responsibility for their environmental impact and achieve carbon neutrality and net zero. And we work with clients one-on-one year-round and also assist businesses with their environmental section of the BIA. And we also have a sister organization called Sense of Scale that is a pending B Corp. So we're very familiar with the B Corp family and process. Excited to be here today. Yes, Nick, you can go next.
Hi guys, Nick Astrosa with South Pole. I'm in charge of our marketing for the North American market, US and Canada. Excited to be here. Net zero, of course, is one of our key focus areas, and we know that it's a key focus area for a lot of B Corps, an increasing number of B Corps, and we're eager to help lead this conversation and help you guys get where you need to be.
And I'll round us out. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, everyone. I'm Reed Shapiro. I'm a business development manager at South Pole, working alongside Nick and Emily, kind of at the tip of the process to help companies understand what specific aspects, in this case of net zero, are relevant and should be taken into consideration, making sure everyone gets into the right hands, very capable hands at South Pole. And I have also worked at a B Corp since I graduated college and helped that company achieve and maintain its B Corp status. And I'm a co-founder of B Local NYC back in 2017 or 2018, and big fan of this community. Very happy to be back on one of these panels.
Great, thank you everyone for your introductions. So how today's event will be structured, I'll kick off walking through the panelists, a bunch of questions that we've prepared, but at the 30-minute mark, I will turn it over to you, the audience, to submit your questions, and then we can turn those over to the panelists as well. So to get started, I wanted to call to everyone's attention, a lot of concerns and questions I think we all in the industry have been having around net zero, and that being kind of the changing, shifting definition of what net zero is. So as some of you may know, SBT recently came out with some guidance on a definition of net zero, but I wanted to share with everyone B Corp's definition of net zero and then give the panelists an opportunity to provide their definitions. So B Corp defines net zero as having companies commit to achieving net zero emissions by 2030, that being their scope 1 and 2 emissions, as well as the most relevant scope 3 emissions, and achieving this by reducing emissions wherever possible and utilizing verified offsets, especially carbon removal projects to balance emissions that cannot be eliminated. So also kind of noted by the B Corp is that as part of this commitment, it is also recommended that companies aligned with science-based targets to achieve their reduction strategy in using the most gold standard certified carbon offsets and other products to remove other emissions. So that's the B Corp's definition, but let's kick things off with you, Anna. Would love to hear your definition of net zero and maybe any comments you have on B Corp's definition.
Yeah, for sure. This industry is really, this whole carbon footprinting reduction offset space is really kind of the wild, wild west. And I think there's a lot of buzzwords and definitions that pop up all the time, and different definitions and different rules that go along with it. But, you know, I would kind of give anything for some sort of climate change dictionary where it's one place that we look and we understand what the definition of that word is, but we haven't really gotten there yet. But, you know, it's really that once all the energy that you are to be using, let's say in your house, is going to be, you're going to be generating as much as you're using. So that's really like the broad term of it. And then really for me, the definition of net zero has to be with the parameters that the company or the company family provides. So in this case, the B Corp definition is going to be law, you know, for B Corps. Other groups like the American Institute of Architects, however, you know, they have a definition for their 2030 commitment, and they are not allowed to use any sort of carbon offsets in that achievement. So, but, you know, B Corp's definition does abide with the IPCC. And so obviously that's a good reference place. And a few things that I love about B Corp's definition is that it really balances the need of being specific so that people understand what the rules are, but understanding the need of flexibility, right? So it does say most relevant aspects of scope 3 emissions. And I think that might be a vague word, relevant, but I think that is why you need advisors like everybody on this panel to help you identify what is relevant for you, right, in that scope 3 category. No two businesses are the same, no two carbon footprints are the same, no two scope 3s are the same. And so really having someone where this is what they do day in and day out, help you understand what that term relevant is. But I also think it's very, very, very honorable and good that there's at least some sort of fine print below it. So we used the term carbon neutral for a very long time and it had no fine print. So it was even more vague as to what that meant and how to claim that. So at least I feel like B Corp has, and the IPCC and UFCCC and all these definitions, the EPA, they at least have some fine print with it. So while it does vary, I think we're getting closer to something that's agreed upon.
Definitely agree there. The fine print is so important when kind of having these initial initiatives and actions taken by companies. David, I'm wondering, would love to hear a little bit about your definition and specifically how you guide clients through understanding what is their maybe relevant scope 3 emissions, as Anna pointed out.
Well, both of you hinted at it, but given that different groups might have different definitions, what's really relevant here is actually what program you sign up for. So if you're in the B Corp community, you have a net zero by 2030 goal, following the B Corp guidance kind of makes a lot of sense. I think, Emily, you had mentioned earlier, Science-Based Targets is also working on their definition. So they have like a foundations paper and they're kind of working on defining it. And if you sign up for Science-Based Targets, and I guess this is maybe a spoiler for later, but if you do have a net zero goal, I would certainly recommend you have a science-based target for reasons we can get into later. But for the organizations that I've seen grappling with net zero, they're effectively treating it the same as carbon neutral. The fact that you have to remove as many greenhouse gas emissions as you put into the atmosphere. And that should include looking at scopes 1, scope 2, scope 3, though there are companies that are just doing that for their scope 1 and scope 2 where they have more control. And I mean, ultimately for me, definition certainly matters, but as long as you're in the ballpark here, it's not really the definition that's much of an operative question to me. And I think the clients I work with is the details to achieve it. So what mechanisms are appropriate and credible for removing emissions? And how much do you have to reduce your emissions from a baseline by the time the goal has arrived? So there certainly are kind of questions like that. I think what we do know is there's really an explosion of companies embracing this. So in addition to the B Corp community, over the course of 2020, the number of companies committing to net zero doubled. I think it was like at least 1,500, I think, at the end of 2020. So with that, it's also become a fairly contentious term in some ways, mostly from the perspective of stakeholders who don't believe that some of the companies committing to net zero are credible or sincere. And I think that's why it's really important that we do this well.
Definitely, all great points. And Reed, I'd be interested to hear you kind of bounce off some of those thoughts. As Anna and David mentioned, a lot of companies are aligning to B Corp guidance if they're a B Corp, or whatever other standard that they're most comfortable with aligning to. What about those companies that maybe are at the start of their journey and have not yet aligned to any sort of standard but want to be net zero? What is the definition that you would use, or how would you navigate these changing definitions and kind of offer some guidance there?
I think you kind of just answered it at the end there yourself. And I agree with Anna and David pretty much to a T. It's interesting because there are certain technical natures of this in terms of like defining carbon neutrality versus climate neutrality versus net zero. There are distinctions that I think can be made between those. And I'd like to kind of dig into them a little bit and bounce back to the panel and see if they agree as well. But ultimately, this is an enormous amount of work that has to be undertaken at a global scale. And organizations like Science-Based Targets are still providing guidance. There's forthcoming guidance. We understand, probably Climate Week this year or COP this year. So it'll take its time, and given that a significant number of companies, not all the companies committing to net zero targets are B Corps. So a significant number of them are taking a 2050 or 2040 timeline as opposed to 2030. And by definition, the actions that companies who are addressing these issues at the initial phase of the drawdown effort, the strategies, the resources at hand, the methods that have been developed and proven, and as David mentioned, that are appropriate and for a company within a certain circumstance, within a certain situation to hit their target against the baseline. There is a lot that's still up in the air, and it really needs to be a focus more so on what are best practices in reduction of scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3, and how can those be internalized and ultimately, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because I know that those are questions for later on. But in terms of the definition of it, the one nuance that I would add is that, and this is, I guess, perhaps technical or nitpicky, but this was my provenance in this space. So the distinction between carbon neutrality and net zero is ultimately that, for those who otherwise wouldn't know, that carbon is only one of the 6 greenhouse gases. That is only a subset of the total greenhouse gas inventory a company might have. Of course, it can all be equalized into CO2 equivalent, but to report on it and to count for all of the different gases would then lead to climate neutrality. And then the way that I like to think about carbon neutrality, climate neutrality, and the difference between net zero is you still have a big chunk of emissions that the organization creates. And while you may finance emissions reductions with offsets elsewhere, it's still those 2 big chunks that aren't the same system of creating a balance. Whereas with a net zero company or a net zero organization or country or world, it's really a matter of having systems and processes in the way that things are produced and delivered and used and disposed of balance out and be a full cycle of actions and actions for creation of emissions and actions for reduction of emissions. And that, well, I'll pause there.
Thanks for that, Reed. And I think something too, it sounds like everyone's hinting at in their responses is that the lack of a strong definition or strong terminology with kind of those refined, as you said, Anna, fine print, it really opens a lot of opportunity for companies, as you said, David, to say they want to be net zero and not really know what that means. So interested to hear from you, David. How do you advise companies, or what advice would you give to companies to set these goals in a way that isn't actually greenwashing and that has, strong, meaningful climate action?
So I think it really depends where companies are at in terms of sort of their entry point or where they focus in net zero. So some companies that are now hearing about net zero actually haven't done their greenhouse gas inventory. And I probably would have said even just a few years ago, most companies taking on these bolder goals would have been relatively sophisticated, but it's just sort of a sign of just how things are evolved and how many companies are getting involved. So inventory, doing your accounting and understanding what your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 are is the first place I would recommend to start if you haven't done yet, so you actually know what emissions you're trying to zero out. If you already have done an inventory, I find the work looks more like planning. So going back to what Reed was touching on, coming up with a portfolio of projects to advance across your value chain. And one area our firm has been asked to put effort is modeling planned actions forward into the future, where you look at your current actions, the efficiency, renewables, other value chain, regenerative agriculture, whatever is specific to your industry, looking at all those actions, quantifying the expected impact over time, whether you do that now or 2025 or 2030, and looking at the effect on overall emissions. And that can get involved if you're trying to more involved than simply detailing the greenhouse gas emissions and carbon removal, because you have to incorporate other factors like expected growth rate and greening of the electric grid. And I know I'm getting into more of the technical details here, but it's really more about sort of a predictive capacity to have some assurance that what you plan is going to get you a significant way toward the goal. It's hard to say, especially with some of these longer timeframes, because some companies are looking 2040 and 2050 if they're not B corporations. It's kind of hard to predict with certainty what that is, but at least or guarantee that you can hit the goal. But I think having some assurances is where I see companies, kind of certainly investing a lot of effort.
Definitely, completely agree there. And Anna, I'm interested in hearing a little bit from you. Like, what are kind of some of the strategies that you would employ to avoid greenwashing amongst corporates?
This is my favorite question, the one that makes me the most angry. I think that everybody here, in attendance understands the term of greenwashing, which is really a company or even an individual kind of celebrating their green initiatives, and either they're lying or the initiatives that they are implementing are not tackling the biggest component of their carbon footprint. And so, a really good example I like to give is, not going to mention any company names here today, but in hotels, when they really applaud their towel reuse, and I please reuse your towels. I'm not saying don't reuse your towels, but most of the time hotels have incredibly inefficient lighting, and there's just, if I were to calculate the carbon footprint, I'm pretty sure that the towels would not be the biggest piece of the pie that then I would have a responsibility to tackle. And there's a lot of examples of this. Another one would be, big soda companies that have, a few electric vehicles, which again is great. Please do that. But they haven't started to tackle the plastic problem. And so if this isn't your space, if this is not what you're looking into day in and day out, doing the math of what we need to do to get to where we need to go, you're going to look at those things and think we're well on our way. And so it's actually doing the opposite. It makes you feel like you don't have to do as much because, man, the big guys are doing it. And it's incredibly dangerous. And so to avoid that, again, like David was saying, I mean, you can only improve what you can measure, right? And so you've got to get an assessment. I mean, and I feel like you need assistance. I mean, if you're not an accountant, you might not know how to balance your checkbook or set up a retirement. And so you hire someone for that. And so to be efficient, somebody that's in the space 24/7 can assess that for you and make sure that you identify the biggest piece of your pie. Then you have a responsibility to tackle that first. And then I think the other way to kind of avoid the greenwashing and hold people accountable for it is really that gut check. Is this really the most important thing that you need to be focusing on right now? Is there something that's telling you that you might be like not doing something that just because it seems too big or too hard? And hold people accountable. I mean, start to see it. I bet now you will never go in a hotel and see that sign and not roll your eyes. And so holding people accountable for that, I think is huge. We're noticing that peer pressure is productive. I mean, there are so many companies that are committing to net zero that I'm not sure if they had to change a heart, but I'm pretty sure that they're doing it to keep their clients and to keep their customers. And so peer pressure works, accountability works, keep your eyes open. And yeah, I think for everybody on this panel, I mean, we are the environmental accountants. I call myself Mother Earth's accountant. And so if you can measure and identify the key contributors, then you will feel very good about not greenwashing, not slapping some sort of claim, that maybe isn't true or maybe just wasn't the thing that you should have been focused on.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. As a GHG accountant myself, the bedrock for any strategy is strong, robust accounting. So definitely agree there. And Rita, I'm interested in hearing from you kind of on a similar vein. A lot of companies are talking about going beyond net zero and making claims about being carbon negative. What are your thoughts on, this carbon negative terminology, and is it the next step beyond zero? And if not, what is?
Funny, because I feel like I've heard carbon negative, carbon positive, climate negative, climate positive, like everything in between, and this, that, the other way. It's like when you are on a hiking trail at the top of a summit and there are all the signs going in every which way. So I totally agree with Anna. If we had some sort of like a King James climate dictionary, that'd be wonderful, because I think ultimately, just to level set, it pull down more than you're putting out, right? So that everyone I feel like always knows that they're on the same page. We need it immediately. We need to be carbon negative immediately. So, that should be kind of the guiding star and at the end of the day. But regarding this greenwash point, I mean, we live in such a polarizing world today where your action is either perfect and right and you're on track, or it's greenwash. And ultimately, I think to demystify a lot of that, Anna touched on it and David touched on it, it's a matter of having your proper metrics and understanding the full scope of what the impact is so that you can properly manage it. And in terms of, if someone wants to set a carbon negative goal, great. But if they don't have any of the other stuff figured out, if they don't understand how they're going to reach carbon neutrality, climate neutrality, hit their science-based target on the way to net zero, and then get to net zero, then it's gonna sound phony. And really, I feel like the way around it is, as everyone's been saying, know what you're doing, just as a business, and understand how the actions that you're proposing or that you're going to take aren't just some like, oh yeah, let's deal with our emissions and take these actions. And it's more so, how are these actions going to evolve our business into something that runs on this balanced model? And so, yeah, but in terms of the carbon negative question, especially sitting as a business development manager at South Pole, yeah, of course we need as many removals as immediately as possible. Because again, something that I've been writing blogs about since like 2016 has been just the immense nature of the carbon gap that we have. And it's great that everyone is now racing towards net zero. And I don't mean to say that about the B Corp community around here, but this is a hot button issue now. Companies are taking flack for this on a large scale. But I think as practitioners and folks who know that there is legitimacy behind this and there's real business sense behind all of this stuff, we should be trying to guide this conversation in terms of, well, there's something other than greenwash or perfect, and in the nature of even the science-based targets, you've got 2 years between when you commit and when you say something, and so I think the expectation, the scrutiny should still be there. We shouldn't be letting people off the hook, because there are lots of folks who are making 2050 commitments and don't have substantial plans to back it up. Now, what's really critical is going to be if they're coming out with legitimate plans within the 2-year periods in which they're doing it. And if they're not, then we as a community need to really be figuring out, and again, in the midst of constantly changing guidance from the powers on high. So much you can really do definitively, but just backing up with the work.
Emily, if I could touch on that too, if you don't mind. I think beyond net zero, like net zero is so good. And I hate to be like the downer here, but it's barely the beginning, and we should have been doing this a long time ago. And, we're not done until we're all done, like until we are all done, until balance is restored. And so if you commit to this goal, and also, 2030, it feels incredibly far away. And I think that, again, there's a lack of understanding of like not knowing where to start, or it feeling big. And I think that for a lot of organizations, it can be achieved a lot sooner. And once you achieve it, you are not done until we are all done. You need to tell your story, help other people not be, feel like it's such a vague roadmap. You need to, pressure others, say, oh, look at all the press I'm getting from doing this wonderful thing. I mean, we need to be doing all of it. Like, reusing your towels is a really big deal too. And so any and all, but I don't think that this is important, and it needs to be done. And I am so incredibly grateful that after a decade of me having to explain what I do and why, I don't have to explain it anymore. So I'm very pleased. But I don't want us to lose sight of the urgency and the severity and how late we are, and how 2030 to me feels like very generous. And I swear, if you get this roadmap and you get started on your journey sooner, you're going to sleep better. I think a lot of these people that have committed might not know, where to start. And that bothers me, because we could take care of this, and then we can move on to another commitment for 2030. So I just think, I have a lot of obviously very passionate feelings about going beyond. I think we're going to have to continue to push forward until we're in a place where we're all out of work. So yeah, I hope that people, don't just jump on this commitment, but they get started like yesterday.
Honestly, that was my goal when I got into this industry. I'd love to figure it out and then not have a job anymore and go do something else that wasn't like required of us to continue to be able to do something else.
Amen.
Most definitely. And I think it's that fine line, right? You want to keep that accountability, keep that action going, but still bring people in to learn and grow and develop and improve their strategies year over year. So I know that's something all of us as consultants are constantly grappling with. One more question before we actually open it up to the audience for questions. I'd like to field this one to David. I know climate justice is an issue that a lot of us have been really passionate and interested in lately, and there's been a lot of, I think, question marks on how to meaningfully incorporate climate justice into strategies. So interested in hearing from you, David. What are your thoughts about incorporating climate justice into broader net zero strategy? What is some tactical advice you can give to the folks here today?
And that's a critical issue, because B Corporation put out this year that climate justice is one of their 3 fundamental goals. And I think you touched on it in terms of making it tangible. I think very often, sometimes the conversation seems to remain abstract. Like, we hear about a problem kind of around climate justice, but there's not real way to like move forward on it. And that can feel dissatisfying. I think a portion of it is not necessarily kind of knowing all the answers, kind of going into it, and we have to be okay with that. But essentially what climate justice means to me is really grappling with the fact that the most heavily impacted by the climate crisis are those with relatively little resources, whether that's less affluent nations kind of around the planet, whether that's poverty stricken within nations, and people of color. What climate justice also means is doing what you can to ensure these groups benefit from climate solutions. And that to me is kind of where the real kind of, actionable, tangible piece of this kind of comes in, because given the state of where things are at, there's not a lot we can kind of do about that. We can make sure that our solutions help address that. So I think probably most of you have heard about the climate justice playbook that the B Corporation community has. And so that provides a process, if not answers. And you really need to just dive in and understand, what would really be a benefit to those groups. there's sort of a consultation engagement process kind of in that. And I also know it can be hard coming from the outside of these communities. If you're clear that you have a solution, whether you provide lithium ion batteries or you do tree planting, it can be hard. Like if you're clear that's a benefit, to enter with an open mind, but how those solutions are implemented is really key. And you'll have a better project with that upfront work if you design kind of an intervention, a climate solution to really kind of benefit communities that are being impacted by the climate crisis. And I'll leave it there, but very interested to hear from others kind of what their take is.
Thanks for that, David. Reed, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. The climate justice issue is something I think is like really so essential, but it's very hot button, and it's easy to misstep if you're not very aware and have a very clear vision for it, and do it authentically in a way that isn't social justice washing. And at the B Corp that I worked with, we were a carbon offset brokerage, and at South Pole, we are the largest developer of carbon offset projects in the world. And I know that part of the BIA takes into account the investments, like things in offsets that companies are making, and the co-benefits and the contributions to sustainable development goals that are achieved through that financing of emissions reductions. And that in and of itself can be very targeted, specifically if there are pillars of ESG impact that companies espouse or have as part of their strategic backbone. And there are projects all around the world that will have alignment from a kind of leveling of the playing field perspective. And that's something that I think needs to be considered more, because again, the gap is so immense. How are you going to do it? And not every business in the world not every business in the world has an immediate social justice alignment that they can just whip out and say, this is what we're putting in the game. And I think I'm sure we've all seen companies kind of do this, this virtue signaling. And it's the same thing with the net zero commitments. It's got to be integrated. It's got to be a part of the business. And so, in addition to something like purchasing offsets, there does need to be more that is easily accessible, and that companies can have a number of things that, if they so choose as a company, even if there isn't relevance to the business, that they're going to legitimately support it. I think there do need to be avenues for that. That there are most probably legit, really good ones that exist today within the B Corp community, but there needs to be a coherent, lighthouse for this, and guidance, and greater coagulation of community action to a point where we can get consensus on. Same thing with climate targets. What is acceptable and legitimate and appropriate?
And I'll answer that too. I'm sorry, you done, Reed?
Yeah, I was just saying it's also like everything here that we're discussing is interconnected. You don't have the social justice without the net zero alignment.
Yeah, I feel the exact same way. My degree is in architecture, and I feel like it's design, right? You're designing a roadmap or a blueprint, or you're designing a way to do things better, and you don't just consider plumbing or electrical, or you have to think of all of them at the same time. You want them all to run parallel for efficiency. And so when you are going to take a look at your impact, you not just environmentally, but on your earthly neighbors, right? Like, how is this decision, if I'm going to change this, how is it going to affect future generations, or empower groups that have not been empowered, or change the way it's always been done that is a broken old way? You're about to adopt something in the spirit of a healthier and more balanced planet. So why not think of like all the crises at the same time? I think you said, Reed, you said the word integrate, and that's exactly right. I think, we tend to do things in a siloed way. So many nonprofit wants to save whales, and this person is education in low-income schools, and even in medicine, you go in for a hurt knee and they treat the knee. And so really to zoom out, and yes, my field is the environmental component, but you've got to be able to zoom out and see the problem as a whole, so that when you are taking the admirable step of saying, I commit to being better, know better, do better, you need to be doing that across all things. So I think that it's long overdue that it is a part of all of the crisis conversations. I think it's a crisis.
Definitely, and I think you said it well, Anna. It's long overdue indeed. So for now, just to address some of the audience questions, I know we've had a bunch of people asking about how companies can include some of these more niche GHGs, most specifically refrigerants, into their net zero strategy. How does that look in practice? And I'll pitch it to the entire panel for anyone who has thoughts.
I mean, to me, it's all part of the accounting. There's a process you go to come up with the footprint of refrigerants versus combusting fuels and kind of other greenhouse gases. We had talked about 6 or 7 greenhouse gases earlier, but in my experience, most companies I've worked with have like maybe 4, mostly from fossil fuel combustion refrigerants, but that's certainly something you have to include. And there's ways to quantify the footprint.
Definitely. And then Anna or Reed, what would be the process that you could see incorporated into a net zero strategy to reduce those refrigerants before turning to offsets?
Refrigerants. I know that there are some emerging technologies within the refrigerant space that are able to recycle them more effectively. I am not sure if there is a functioning commercial model of circular refrigeration, but it's something that I've personally had interest in since I saw its prominence on the drawdown list. But yeah, I mean, again, ultimately it comes down to the efficiency and the utility of the machines that are using the refrigerants and the systems that are using the refrigerants. If those are notoriously leaky, or if they're out of date, or if there are new upgrades, I think that would be the core move. I imagine it's a function of available tech that are other than perhaps some sort of, if you're shipping with refrigerants, perhaps some sort of logistic efficiency in the way that you're shipping. But
yeah, I think you're right. I think there's so many variables, this sounds like a cop-out answer, but it's like, well, it depends on where you're geographically located. It depends on what it's being used for. It depends on, just so many things, which is why like I've felt like, this like one-on-one like interview process to understand somebody's operation, and desires, and maybe it isn't the biggest piece of their footprint, but they just hate it. And so I think it's so dependent and so custom per person. And like Reed also said, there's new technologies happening that are coming out as we're on this panel, you know, which is why I just hit refresh over and over. So yeah.
And just one other, yeah, that was the piece of the question that I didn't address. So I think when you're speccing new equipment, you can look at lower global warming potential refrigerants. It's unfortunately, my investigation kind of shows that it's not very easy or straightforward to just like swap out refrigerants, unfortunately, to like try to get lower. But if you're replacing equipment, you know, that can be an option. And I think in procurement, I think it's not an area like looking at the refrigerants probably like not even on, because you have to go way into the technical details to find out what it is anyway. But you know, that's something to certainly consider.
Yeah, on that as well, I think, again, how can this be widely adopted? It should be, it's like, it's the same question as like, why aren't we taught personal finance in high school? This information should be more readily available and less, I don't even want to call it taboo, but yeah, to the extent that, I don't know if there is a B Corp guide to refrigerant use where possible, as you have business control, but maybe there should be, you know?
Thanks for that. All great points. And of course, as you all alluded to, refrigerants are kind of one of the more complex and hard to grasp emissions categories. So appreciate the insights there. Another question we received from our audience is that many companies are joining various commitments, such as 1% for the planet and other such goals. We're wondering, you know, what roles that these memberships can play in getting to net zero. You know, obviously the 2030 net zero climate commitment for B Corp is one of these. How do we think that they can help companies reach net zero, and what sort of catalyst can they be for companies?
I can start with that. As a nonprofit, we're part of 1% for the planet. And so a few thoughts. One, you know, being a part of 1% for the planet, they have a, you know, you don't just get in, like you have to make it. And so it's a really good, just like becoming a B Corp, it's a really good identifier of nonprofits that are, you know, following all the rules, doing things in a good way. So we have had people that come to work with us to calculate their footprint and help with their reduction strategies, just because we're 1% for the planet member. The other thing is that I think it's, again, like just broken record here, that it's that peer pressure. I mean, you can go on a lot of websites of some pretty well-known companies and you see that 1% for the planet. And whether, you know, I've seen it where people are like, what is that? I want that for me. And then you just go down this kind of improvement rabbit hole of all the different 1% for the planet. And for those that don't know, 1% means that 1% of your profits is going to go towards environmental causes, because only 3% of the entire charity sector is given to environmental organizations. So 1% for the planet is asking businesses to take 1% of their profits and give it to environmental causes. So I think, you know, I think it's a peer pressure thing. I think it's a vetted, you know, organization thing. I know for a fact that there are a lot of B Corps that are also 1% for the planet members. And so it's kind of this little like club we're forming, I guess. So yeah, I think it's all hand in hand. I really do. Yeah, and it's a good place to start. I mean, just to identify that there's a need and to take a step to help with the need, like, I'm for it.
Play devil's advocate a little bit there. I think that, and in full disclosure, I've also been a business member of 1% for the planet for several years, and love the organization, and agree that there is so much synergy between 1% and B Corp. But, you know, to this, I got a question. I can't remember at this point if it was a direct message in the chat, but, you know, on commitment fog and too many cooks in the kitchen effectively in terms of B Corp net zero, 1% for the planet, all this stuff. It becomes, I would caution just to like, there are ways where 1% for the planet and B Corp and it could be used synergistically, and net zero could all fit together, I think, in terms of identifying how the nonprofit community within the 1% for the planet community can drive the 1%, because it's significant volumes of money every year now that the community is generating towards environmental and social justice work. So how can we get those, if there is a way that, and I think that there is ultimately probably some sort of a, I don't know, they are distinct brands, but they meld pretty nicely together. And I'm sure there's some sort of alignment that the BIA and the way that the point system works within the B Corp community could align with, and they already do, I think, take into account the charitable donations that companies give to 1% for the planet. So there already is some of it. But to the extent that that can then go a little deeper and be a little more granular in terms of how does this translate into not only charitable giving, but our contributions to our net zero targets as well. That I think would be a nice place to bring that, but without having something nicely pointed and specific, with a specific vision to it. It's like you throw the climate neutral label in there, you throw some of these other labels that are emerging. It's like it becomes a mess, and it's quite the ocean of that stuff at this point. So to the extent that someone like B Corp and 1% can provide a nice nugget, a nice shining star to follow, I think there is room there for that.
Thanks for that. And then one last question, and I'll hand it over to David to kind of kick off the discussion on this one. But finance and the finance industry are really key to enabling and driving net zero. Obviously, individuals can change their bank accounts and choose more ethical investments, but how can B Corps apply pressure? What is their leverage in this ecosystem?
Great question. So part of the reason that I see that so many companies have been adopting net zero and just gone deeper into climate in the last couple of years is specifically because the investment community and finance communities have kind of gotten on board. Not a lot of us heard the term ESG 5 years ago. Now you can't open a page on GreenBiz without seeing it. So I think there's certainly a lot of heightened interest, I think, investors to wanting to know that their money is kind of going to good causes. And this has gotten some banks involved. So the Science Based Targets actually has a whole financial sector initiative. And I think it's a little different than looking at your footprint in the way we usually look at Scope 1, Scope 3, because they're looking at the impacts of their investments. And I don't have all the details on the tool, but I think it does kind of take a different form. In terms of B Corps, as many of us smaller companies able to have leverage on a financial institution, I'm not going to say that's easy. I think if you're working with a company, you can work with the beneficial state banks and the others that are already kind of aligned with the B Corporation. Getting other banks to shift is hard, but I think your voice is certainly part of a lot of pressures that they should have to make sure that their investments are going to responsible projects, and that they have some sort of criteria beyond just like making money off their loans.
Yeah, I wanted to say too, there's another session at 4 p.m. today that's changing finance to finance change. And so I've dealt a lot in this space in the last year or so, really understanding even in my own portfolio of where your dollars are sitting. And it's very hard to find answers to that. And it is terrifying. So there's a whole session about what to do about that. And yeah, it's been, I don't apologize for not knowing all the things. I'm addicted to learning, but it was really recently that I realized the severity of our finances and where they're sitting and what they're supporting. just like, this is totally random, but just like in a session yesterday, I realized somebody shared that all of the carbon footprint of the internet is worse than the aviation industry combined. So that was another aha moment for me. So I think that we don't need to feel bad for these aha moments. And so I've definitely recently had my financial investment aha moment, and it is incredibly important. Of all the things that, you know, we identify with our clients as priorities, you know, things move so fast, and things that you know, we're looking at, and that list just continues to grow and grow and grow.
Most definitely. And I hear you on kind of that digital landscape is huge. And if we had more time, I'd love to dive into it. But on kind of a similar closing note, one question we have been getting from a lot of companies or a lot of audience members is that obviously we have all these scope 3 emissions that may or may not be relevant. Some of them, like you alluded to, kind of these digital assets, but also things like hot water. You know, how should companies determine what is relevant for scope 3? We talked a little bit about this easier, but any quick, you know, thresholds, rules of thumb, or just some tangible advice companies can walk away with after they've built that GHG footprint for themselves to determine, okay, what should we include in our net zero strategy? What should be included in that boundary?
I'll start, I guess. It's infinite. Scope 3 is infinite. It is incredibly hard. I think that we again have to understand where you are and what your industry is, and what your sales are. I mean, we have to know so many things. And then I think that all of us here, you know, we have developed over the decade of our, you know, expertise of this sense of scale, right? We have a little bit of a internal understanding of like what's worse or what's going to be bigger than the other. And then, you know, for us, I love going down the scope 3 hole as far as anybody wants to go. And again, like David said before, I mean, you just don't know until you take a look at it and measure it. Somebody mentioned, you know, for example, what emissions related to the hot water a consumer uses with the soap in the shower deemed relevant for the soap manufacturer. I mean, it becomes like philosophical, you know, and like ethical. And for me, it's like, are you responsible for this big footprint thing happening? And whether it's somebody else's responsibility or not, you know, if I order a package, it is on the package company to offset their footprint and to have electric vehicles, but that package would not have come had I not hit my button on my computer. So it's that gut checking of like, if I did not exist, would these emissions have happened? And so it's really a judgment call. It's not black and white. I think there's a lot that goes into deciding the term relevant. It's not black and white.
And there are groups like Gold Standard, again, along with science-based targets, that have put together guidance about what they're calling interventions in your value chain. And I think the example about the hot water and the soap that Anna just mentioned, and I saw also on the chat, you know, that's kind of more downstream. I see companies looking more upstream. So for example, if you're in food or fiber, there are a lot of companies looking at like reforestation and tree planting at some of their source farms, because that's kind of more directly, even though, you know, arguably kind of trees aren't necessarily tied to the actual emissions, but it's quite close to their value chain, and they're going to get credit for that. Another place that I think is great for companies to look at is installing renewables at their suppliers. So whether it's you know, looking at electrification or just putting solar up to help power their industries, that's a very direct way to address your scope 3 footprint. Some of those other places that Anna was sort of getting to are just like a lot harder to touch. Like if you're looking at you know, end of life, depending on if you can recapture your product or just how the customer uses it, you could be a couple levels away from that. And that's probably a good example of where offsets are going to be more likely. Although even in that example, you could at least put like advocacy advocacy toward like, water efficiency standards in showers. So you have at least more water footprint. There's different ways to like sort of get at it.
Definitely.
And just to add perhaps maybe the other side of the spectrum, generally from a greenhouse gas accounting standpoint, things are considered definitely relevant if they are more than 5% of your total emissions. So Emily, you asked about thresholds. That is not necessarily to say that if you're setting a net zero target, you should be completely disregarding anything that has less than 5% of your emissions, because you could have lots of things that are 4.9% of your emissions that add up to 25% of your emissions, and that would be relevant. Clearly, the gut check is totally part of this, but you kind of got to just think about it from a mathematical standpoint as well. Once you have you got to have a full scope 3 inventory to understand what's relevant and what's not relevant. You can't, I do think the gut check, you got to have that, but you can't just do the gut check and say, well, I think this is good. Let's go spend 90% of our climate budget for the next decade on this subset of things. And then you get 7 years into it and you realize that you're in deep yogurt. So I think that the relevancy, Anna pretty much got it on the head, but again, use some metrics as well and make sure that you're covering enough of it. And if you're at a point where you've got 95% of your scope 3 mapped out on how you're going to get to net zero, do that and then worry about the 5%, the relevant pieces.
Exactly. And to Anna, your point originally, the impacts of scope 3 are infinite and the solutions are as well. So with that, I'd like to close out the panel. Thank you so much to our 3 panelists today and for all your insightful comments. And I'd also like to thank Nick Astor and Karen for also organizing this event and getting it off the ground. I know how much hard work it took to get us all here. So thank you to all. And of course, thank you to our audience members for your participation and your great questions today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you, everyone.
Good to be here. Go net zero, but credibly.
That's right. Take care, everyone.
Meaningful climate action. Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.